Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the presentation, Writing in the Public Interest. My name is Terry Kendrick, and I'm a volunteer for the Festival of the Book. And before we get started, I just want to remind folks to please turn off your cell phone. And I'll introduce the two panelists, and then they'll take it from there. So first, Ginny Merriam graduated from the University of Montana School of Journalism and worked as an award-winning reporter and editor at the Missoulian for 20 years. In 2006, she went to work for the City of Missoula and Mayor John Engen as the communications director for the city. She continues to work as a freelance journalist and is a frequent contributor to Montana Magazine. Richard Manning is the author of 8 books, including most recently, Rewilding the West, Restoration in a Prairie Landscape. And his book, One Round River, was named a significant book of the year by the New York Times. His essays and articles have been published in Harper's, Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, Wired, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times, as well as many other publications. He is the winner of the University of Montana Mansfield Center's Lud Brahman Award for Science Writing, Richard Margolis Award for Environmental Writing, Montana Audubon Society Award for Environmental Reporting, and the 3-time winner of the C.B. Blethyn Award for Investigative Journalism. And Richard will be available shortly after the presentation to sign some of his work. Thank you very much.
Terry, thank you. See if this works. Loud enough? No. No? Can you hear me now?
Sure.
Is that working? Thanks for being here today. Dick and I are going to talk with you, and we hope that also we'll hear something back from you today about a topic that we talk about between ourselves a lot and with other colleagues. What about journalists who no longer work for news organizations? And we're going to talk, I think, a little bit more about what about those journalists rather than where will we all get our news, but we may stray over into both those places. So I'm going to sort of set the stage for us today, and then Dick is going to take it out into the future. So this past Monday morning, of course I've been thinking about this all week and what we might talk about. This past Monday morning, the first sentence I heard was on NPR, because I wake up and then immediately start feeding my news habit by turning on the radio. First sentence I hear is that the New York Times will announce Monday that they're going to lay off 100 people. That the remaining employees will have a 5% pay cut for the rest of the fiscal year. And this is something that we hear so much now, we're almost becoming immune to it. Every newspaper, from our own newspaper all the way to the biggest ones, losing their staffs. Last year alone, 2,400 print journalists in the United States lost their jobs. And that's 4.4% of the entire print workforce, not even including radio journalists, television journalists. And we find when we think about it that really reflects the world as it is now. The New York Times has 800,000 subscribers, but newspaper website readers number 70 million. And people are reading them for free. And I say that without value judgment. I say it mostly as economically, that does not seem to be working. Richard Rodriguez has a wonderful essay in the November Harper's magazine where he talks about newspapers in their twilight. This resonates particularly for me. He says, when a newspaper dies in America, it is not simply that a commercial enterprise has failed, a sense of place has failed. I like that especially because for me, and I think for our entire country, and really for the world wherever they are, newspapers create community. They are the first drafts of history. They are the keepers of the public records, our weddings, our births, our deaths, weather, sports scores, fire calls. For many years when I was a Missoulian reporter, we would go to the fire station every single day and write down where the fire engines went, what time they went there, and what it was. Was it medical aid? Was it a structure fire? And on the days that we were pulled away and we failed to get that in the newspaper, people would call. And we would think, my word, people are calling because they missed the fire calls. But that is community. So newspapers provide us with that shared experience, that pool of information into which really everyone dipped or swam, and reflected our place and kept us together. I don't want to be accused of saying that is exclusive to newspapers, because of course many of us grew up with Walter Cronkite, and television, I think in its early days, and radio have done that for us too. Today, all of that is fractured and fragmented into a million little pieces, and we don't have that glue of the single daily community newspaper that holds us together. A couple of weeks ago, Chris Peck, who used to be the editor of the Spokesman Review in Spokane and now is the editor of the newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee, was here in Missoula. He gave a very thought-provoking talk on this topic, and he talked about Fox News, for example, is find one of those fragments and make it into a business and become profoundly wealthy. I think we're in a time now too where we have the anonymity of online and not having to use our real names, and that undermines community for us. The lines for the average person are very unclear among journalism and real reporting on the one hand, and blogs and personal opinion and comment and tweets and Facebook and various other unsourced tidbits. I actually had somebody say to me recently, in all seriousness, well, I heard that Michael Jackson was dead on Facebook, so? Well, yeah, so. So people say journalism, who needs it? That's worrisome to me, because I think that journalism that matters is under assault, and as Chris Peck said to us when he was here, there's a potential that democracy is in peril because of that. The journalists themselves, who are laid off, displaced, or bailed out because they saw what was coming, or simply decided, I'm making a shift here, may think, who needs us? We're in peril. In truth, though, we're not. There are so many things that journalists are doing in public life now. We're turning up everywhere. It turns out that journalists have skills that matter in other ways, in other arenas in public life. We're great networkers on the phone. We're comfortable with everything and everyone. We're trained as brokers of ideas, and we're able to absorb things, synthesize them into new things, create community in that way. We're trained to evaluate and weigh truth and untruth, tested ideas, untested ideas. We're used to operating in multiple worlds all at the same time instead of being sort of siloed the way many people in many disciplines are today. We also can write. And I have found out in the real world away from newspapers that is really not the case for everybody. I'm not very good at mathematics, and so I don't mean that in a stuck-up way, but it's a valuable skill. It is a little bit horrifying when you leave reporting, strictly doing reporting, and find out I'm in the real world now. I have to actually do things. I was really quite stunned by that, because it is something altogether different to watch what other people do and write about it, or even make comments about it. That is quite a different thing. But even in Missoula, where we see people migrating away from strict reporting jobs, we are everywhere. I run into my colleagues all the time. I noticed some in the audience today, Ian Marquand, who is doing really interesting things, post-television journalism, helping to create a public communication system by radio around the state. I work communicating all different ways for the city of Missoula and find that I'm able to say and write things that are true in ways that I did not do as a reporter. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Dick, and also anybody who wants to butt in with a question, please do.
All right, I'm live, right? Okay. There was a wonderful story in the Times. We're both starting out with Times stories. I should tell you something. It's the only source of information left in the country.
The old gray lady.
Yeah, about rats. And we learn a whole lot from rats in this world. And so they depressed these rats. And don't ask me how one depresses a rat. It's probably a pretty depressing life to begin with. But at any rate, they compare depressed rats and not depressed rats. And the not depressed rats will go hit their bar to get their rat chow, and the rat chow falls out, they eat it, and then the experimenters rigged it so that it only happened once, and so the next time they pressed it, no rat chow, right? Well, the undepressed rats get no rat chow. Where am I going to get my rat chow now? And start to figure out another way. The depressed rats go, no rat chow, no rat chow, no rat chow. And it's the very definition of a depressed person that they keep trying a failed strategy, expecting a different outcome. That describes rats, that describes journalism for the last 20 years. No rat chow, no rat chow. I left daily journalism in 1989, so I literally have not had a job since, up until very recently. And at the time, it was clear where we were headed. And I had a very small picture because I worked for Lee Enterprises here, the evil empire in Montana. And so I always blamed Lee. And then I started to do some research on the internet and said, holy shit, this is happening everywhere. This is happening at every small town paper in the country for some important reasons. 94, 95, I did a fellowship at Stanford for mid-career journalists. So it was 12 of us, spent the year studying journalism and journalism future. Mostly we drank a lot, but we did study some journalism. And I can remember very clearly a seminar by Paul Sappho, who is a futurist. And you see him a lot in Wired magazine. He's one of these trendy California types, predicting the future of the newspaper industry. And he basically went around a room and said, where do you work for, where do you work, where do you work? And he said, you, who work for the New York Times, it was Jane Gross, said, you're going to be able to spend your pension, but none of the rest of you are. And then he described the business model and why it was failing. And during the last 15 years, he's been right on the money. I've just watched it transpire over those 15 years, and literally having the same discussions, the same pressing that bar for that rat chow ever since, saying, how are we going to turn this around? What's the new business model? How are we going to make this happen? It's going to work on the internet. Same damn discussion going on today was going on then, and no one's really had some answers. Meantime, I entertained myself the whole time working both for magazines and writing books. And I watched the same thing happen there. So over 15 years, the ability to make a living in magazine has declined. Not only that, the quality of editing and management of magazines has declined drastically. It has become horrible, to the point that I can't bring myself to pick up the phone and dial that Manhattan area code any longer because of a precipitous decline in quality that's brought on by the same forces that was in the newspaper industry, exactly the same. The book business is not much further behind. It's declining. So I'm watching people out here milling around buying books, and I say, well, isn't that wonderful to see these people actually buying and reading books? Isn't it wonderful to see this parade of eccentrics and living fossils that are still doing this? And, you know, bless you all for doing it. But something different needs to happen. I've been able to make a living writing, but that's declined in the last few years. And at the same time, what is really depressing to me, literally depressing. In fact, I'm starting working on a memoir, and I could not read the opening chapter of it this morning in a reading, and I found out that and there are a lot of things in there about the death of my father and stuff like that, but what I could not read was my summary of the death of journalism, because it's something I've done since 1976, and then to watch it go away and have the world say, man, we don't need what you do anymore, is depressing as hell. But I'm not going to keep pressing the bar for the rat chow. And I'm not going to participate in the discussions about, well, can we possibly tweet this some way? Or maybe I can get a Facebook page that's going to make this work. Instead, I think we need to go in other directions, and I have. I'm going to tell you what I've been working on. It's kind of a hybrid, an idea that I had, and I'm going to tell you the upsides and downsides of that. I took a job about 6 months ago at the National Native Children's Trauma Center here at the University of Montana. We're part of a network that deals with traumatized kids, child abuse, and the effects of child abuse. And I can make a wonderful argument for you that that's the nation's #1 public health problem. It's the biggest problem we have. It's particularly pronounced on Indian reservations. And in fact, it's so important as a story, I think it's the most important story I've ever worked on. And I don't think I'm exaggerating in the slightest. That once you understand the implications of this work, you understand that we are rewriting our perception of the human condition and how our brains work, literally. And it includes some very engaged neuroscience that in the last 5 years, we have a completely different view of how the human brain functions and about what human potential is, and things like addiction and juvenile justice and a number of other issues. I know I can't get that story published today. And in fact, I have tried. I was turned down by Harper's. I've worked with Harper's before. My editor loved the story, thought it was a great idea, passed it on upstairs to his boss. His boss says, sounds like a profile. We don't do profiles. Bam, gone. It's not a profile, but that was it. I was in discussions with the New York Times Sunday magazine up until a month ago, and they decided because I had taken the job at the center, because I've tried to do something in a different way, I'm therefore biased and can't write the story for it. Okay, I understand that. That hurts. Because I would love to write the story for the Sunday Times, but I get it. Meanwhile, they're letting Michael Pollan write about food, fine, and there's one more biased about food, but that's, okay. Finally, an editor called me from Oprah Magazine, and I regard Oprah Magazine about like this. I said, will you do this for us? He said, well, know what I was up to, and I told him. I said, yeah, I'll do it. So that's where that ended up. But where this came from was the ability to try out different strategies. And in fact, this publication was not the end of my new job. What was the end was to communicate successfully with small groups of people and to network across the nation in ways that enlighten us here at this center in different ways. And it's that ends up being the important part of my job, that we need to talk to audiences of one. And that's what it comes down to. Journalism and reading has always been an elite exercise, especially print journalism. We've known that. 10% of the people, maybe, in the good days, read books, maybe. And there was a famous experiment done about 15 years ago when one of the magazines, why can't I think of it? One of the national magazines did an experiment where they put a coupon inside of books in a bookstore and said, when you find this coupon, mail it to us, and we'll give you $5. And they did it in like 1,000 books and got like maybe 5 coupons. So that's just people buy books are 10%. The people who actually read them are much smaller still. So once you understand that, you say, well, what really matters here is the flow of information. How can we get the right information to the right people? And I'm going to echo what Ginny said about reporters having some abilities to do that. In fact, every journalist in the world knows that you're running 2 fronts on information all the time. One is your published front, what's in the newspaper, and the other one is what you're passing around your network of various people. It's just reporters are essentially highly paid gossips. That's what you do. You talk to people all around, you know what they're doing, what they're up to, and that's your ability to make that network yield information. You know how to make information flow. And so by doing that, we can have an enormous influence even if we're not published. And so, for instance, working with the group I'm working with, and this is a story that's not depressing, that this kind of approach and our skills can work to effect change. Now, I would much rather be doing journalism. If there were functional newspapers today, that's where I would be. That's what I would want to do. And I miss it every day of my life. But I'm not going to keep pressing the bar for the rat chow, like I said. The group I'm working with, they're academics, right? Well, everybody knows how academics write, and it's not readable. It's really not. They're nice people and all, but they've been taught to write badly. And one of the things they do is write grants. So one of the things I do is say, look, you can't write this way, and in fact take it away from them. So they'll write various pieces of it, but I won't let them write things like abstracts. And I won't let them summarize, and I definitely won't let them talk to reporters until I've told them how. So a grant came through that we were writing, and I wrote the abstract on it, and spent 2 days hammering out 400 words, the toughest sentences I could possibly do. And we got the award. We got $500,000 to help poor kids. But the grant went to a federal agency that will remain unnamed, because I'm not supposed to know this. And our program officer funded only one grant in the United States for this work, ours. Okay. But then word came down from on high, and I mean the secretary level, that something new needed to be done to stop juvenile delinquency in tribal lands. And so it went down, 12 steps to my program officer's level, and they started shaking him and say, what are you guys doing that's good? And in panic, he reached for my abstract, read it back to them. That's all. It went up to the secretary level, came down within a matter of an hour. And they took butcher paper and they started chopping it up and started making it into talking points, so it will be the new request for proposals for the next round of grants. So in other words, our concepts, our ideas, shaped federal policy so dynamically that they're redoing it and redoing their delinquency policy. Now, would I rather be writing this in a newspaper? You bet I would. But if I can have that kind of influence in 400 words, it's been a good day. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I'm concerned about the whole concept of investigative reporting going away. I mean, as you said, the New York Times Sunday magazine didn't want to publish your piece because they said you were part of that organization and therefore biased.
Yeah.
I feel that way about any organization that publishes a piece that argues their point of view. And I feel much more comfortable having supposedly independent journalists going out there and investigating a story. And I feel like Watergate would never have been reported if we lacked investigative journalists. So what are we going to do about that issue? Because I don't trust blogs.
Yeah, and you said you're concerned about investigative reporting going away. It's not present imperfect. It's past tense.
Okay.
It's gone. It is rare now to see something like the E. coli series in the New York Times of 2 weeks ago, which was a wonderful piece of investigative journalism. It's because the Times is the only place left that can pay people to do that. There's no money for this. And it's been drying up for 15 years. It's now gone. That is, it's a legitimate, it's beyond legitimate. That's the overwhelming concern here, that we can't hold people's feet to the fire anymore. Now, I work inside an organization now, and I know we screw up, right? I know we screw up with federal money. And if I were a reporter, I would be going, no matter how much I believe in those people and what they're doing, because that was our job to keep them honest. And I'm sure Jenny will say the same thing about the city, that the kind of people that we were in challenging authority, just they don't exist anymore. So you should be concerned by that. Jerry?
I think I want to echo the same thing, and Richard, I'm one of the people who I haven't learned. I just want to keep pressing the lever saying, where's the rat child? Because there are people like me who work for advocacy organizations who really depend on facts to build a case, and now one can't do that. You know, I remember seeing on the web, I think it might have even been MSN, a plane went down over the ocean a few months ago, and it was reported early on that a 5-year-old had survived that crash. Well, a 5-year-old did not survive that crash, but there was no retraction of that thing. So like any fact can just go out. It can be totally wrong, but there is no consequence for reporting, something that's not accurate. And I think it's really hard then you mentioned, Ginny, about a community, but we have to have a shared understanding of what some problems are. And if you can't rely on any factual information about poverty statistics or Native kids on the reservation, then we sort of stop working to solve problems if we don't really believe the sort of information.
I think it's interesting what you say, Terry, too, about that there's no consequence. There never really has been a consequence. I suppose that if you were a terrible news organization, you were getting everything wrong all the time, your consequence would be kind of the capitalist response of nobody's going to buy your product and you will go out of business. But I do think that it is much more difficult now to believe everything that's reported because of what has happened to the news cycle. It used to be, I'm not really that old, I'm sort of old, but not that old.
No, you're that old.
I'm not as old as you. But say when I came out of journalism school and was a young reporter, which was in the late 1980s, mid 1980s, the news cycle was still, even though we certainly have had radio for a long time and certainly had television, in newspapers you have 24 hours to get it right. And it turns out, while back then that felt like a very short time, that is a very long time now. And now we have television news, it's a news cycle of 5 minutes. Sometimes this drives me crazy about television news because it's what happened in the last 5 minutes. And you see it with, the kid and the balloon just during this past week. Something that caused me some trouble this week was an erroneous report on television that an infant in Missoula had died of H1N1 influenza, and it turned out not to be true. And I don't know everything about why that television station, they do good work, and how it happened that they believed it. I don't know, but I think as we demand and as we are supplied with information constantly in news organizations, I think there's much more a chance to be erroneous and to make a mistake, or to feel that I hear something and I need to run with it. We need to run with it immediately because you have no time to really talk about it the way we used to in newsrooms. Well, what about this? And it's disconcerting.
There's another aspect of that too. It's not just the news cycle, but that paucity of actual information, actual reporting out there doesn't mean that there are not a lot of people willing to talk about it. So it's kind of, I always use the metaphor of hunter-gatherer societies for news organizations. And there's the hunter that goes out and kills this big animal and drags it in. And then there's people editors who kind of skin it out and chew on the hide to get that tan. And we're down to the point where we only have one hunter-gatherer left. And we got thousands of people sitting around the village willing to chew on that same hide over and over again. And so you get the echo chamber effect, where it's that one piece of information that makes a whole news cycle. Every blogger's on it, all the talk shows, Rachel's going to talk about it at night, on and on and on. And that has the effect of making that seem important, like it's the only thing in the world that's going on, as opposed to having this complex flow of information that really more thoroughly describes a society. That's especially true in places that are isolated like we are. So while this situation, you can get fairly good national reporting to this day. The Washington Post does a great job still, although it's financially troubled. The Washington Post makes its money. The reason it's afloat is because it owns the Kaplan testing agents, or the company that supplies standardized tests to universities. That's its cash cow, and its newsrooms operating at a loss. But at any rate, you can get fairly good national reporting. But what's missing is the discussion of places like Montana that used to have really robust discussion used to have tremendous access. When I was a reporter, and I came to the state after working in 2 others, I was shocked at how open our access was and the ability to get public records. Now you have the case like the Barkas case, for instance, where they were able to stonewall for a matter of 3 weeks. I'm telling you, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. What would have happened is that the newspapers would have gotten together or on their own, hired their own damn attorney, went out there and challenged that gag order. We did it. I've defied gag orders in this town. And instead everybody said, oh, okay, gag order, I guess we'll shut up about that. And that's what happened. And instead, and the irony of that is the very attorney we would have hired in the old days to challenge it, they're quoting in the story saying, well, this probably isn't so good. Well, it's not so good, challenge it. Those are gone. So, because we are lacking that kind of discourse, we're going to feel this nationally. We already feel it nationally with the kind of nonsense that's going on with the Tea Party crowd and like that. But where it's going to come home to roost the fastest in places like Montana, because we have lost local journalism.
Will the really small towns newspapers who are, producing maybe once a week, will they help to rescue that? Because they have to depend on other sources?
Yeah, the small town newspapers' business model is really not all that much difference than, let's go into the business model issue, which is important here. I mean, newspapers traditionally made their money on real estate advertising, but classified advertising in general, grocery advertising, and the price you pay for a newspaper pretty much paid for the paper itself with nothing on it and the delivery of it. So it paid essentially nothing. Well, if you're delivering news by the internet, you don't need the paper and the delivery system, so that subscription thing should be a wash, and you still should be able to make money. The problem is that the internet ate the newspaper's lunch. And it was very easy to do. They just go and take the classified advertising. You don't need classified advertising anymore because you can throw something up on Craigslist for free, and that's gone. And they ate the real estate advertising. Realtors now do their own web pages. And they do a very sophisticated job of it, much better than you could ever do in a newspaper. So you'll still see some there. It's declining. And those declining revenues, and it was like anything that was, what we fought in the old days in the newspaper business was everything hung together. So you have to constantly be taking the ad manager and keeping him over on his side of the building, right? Because he's going to come over and mess with your copy. We won those fights almost all the time, right? So, but that was the old fight. Now the fight is the fact that the internet is simply taking off any profitable spot of that newspaper and going, bam, we own it, we ate your lunch. And so it's not like these evil guys in a corporation decided to screw up their own products. It was the internet evolved to the point that it could take every single thing that was profitable out of the papers. And that same thing applies in small towns and big towns. It's across the board. So and there's smaller reasons behind that, but those are the big reasons. And that's why this is so intractable. Because every time somebody, you can go on a newspaper website and say, well, I'll do it on a website now. Well, in the first place, the advertising there is probably nickels compared to dollars in print. So it's not generating that much income. But in the second place, it's also true on a website that if you pay a lot for something like information, you got that cost, and you try to offset it with something that makes a lot of money, any smart programmer can take away what you're offsetting it with. It's very easy to take away that advertising and give it away for free. So the metaphor I often use is saying, here's the business model now. It's very much like the guy who opened a whorehouse in a college town. You go broke because too many people are giving it away.
I would like to add about small town papers. I'm a little bit, in a sense, a little bit more optimistic about them than Dick is, but I do think that the same things are happening to them, but it's slower. It has not arrived yet. One of my former classmates in journalism school is the owner of the Shoto Acantha, and she was in town a couple weeks ago for this Wheeler Center conference where Chris Peck talked, and they are actually doing okay. Not great, and they don't appear to be wealthy, but they're staying afloat. They're working on trying to get more of an online presence. But I think that the reason that is true for very small papers around Montana is that they are in places where the competition is not so great. They don't have maybe people who live in those towns, they still value their newspaper rather than the internet. And also their news is micro, local. So they still have a product that's a news product that you can't get anywhere else. And I think that they will be okay for some time, and who knows what kind of new model may come and save them. It was very interesting at this Wheeler conference a couple weeks ago. There were a few people there who said vehemently, our problem in journalism is that we have given it away for free. And that, so we're giving away news for free on the internet now, and that devalues it. So people think, oh, it's just free, and it's the same as blogs, and it's the same as what we used to call chat rooms, so that we have caused it to lose its own value. So what do we do about that? And there's some interesting proposals going around about what about forming nonprofits and funding newspapers that way. And I think it'll be interesting to see how those things develop.
At what point, how much do you think the reporters themselves are responsible for a 10-year slippage in relevance in a large market?
I would ask that of you.
Well, having ridden the
May I?
newspaper to the ground.
Yeah, may I expose your background here?
Yeah, I've worked
This
with
is
Seattle
Jake
for
Ellison
10
here.
years, and then I worked with Newsland for a few years. And I went online, and I was an online producer for my last 2 years in the paper. And while I could have stayed on at the CLP.com, without a newspaper, it becomes really very meaningless. And so I do something very similar to Jenny. I work at the University of Washington. But that question, really, to both of you, I mean, because, I watch, it's not that reporters don't want to find bad people and expose them. That is our bread and butter, because that's how you get advancement in business as well as accolades.
Yeah.
But there's several things I think that happen that I'd still like to get your point of view on. Investigative journalism became a very scientific, Woodward and Bernstein, right, started the era of investigative journalism by bringing down the president, and they did it by personal relationships with individuals. Today, investigative journalism uses giant models of information to find patterns of abuse in certain big, the problems are problems of models. There are problems. Investigative journalism, you have to have one of the people on that team is a systems analyst kind of individual. So the problem became so big, but I'm not sure that, so I guess I'm saying two things. One, the problem is so big, it became very expensive to do. And the other side is that reporters themselves, I'm not sure, really quite understood that we were no longer having the same impact in our communities, and we were unwilling maybe to change our own approach to how we find information and what information we say.
I got a couple responses to that, and one is that the reporters did change their approach. But let me back up to the technology issue first, because I think that's vital. And in fact, if somebody were to drop me in a newsroom today and actually pay me a salary and say, go investigate, I would feel much more empowered today by the technology that's out there. The ability to find information is incredible, and even information people don't want you to find. And ironically, I started doing this. Back in 1988, I was doing a series on the timber industry for the Missoulian, and that's what got me fired, by the way, eventually. But I went out and bought a Mac Plus, and they wouldn't buy me one, so I bought my own damn Mac Plus, set it up, and got a hold of a database for the timber industry, and punched it all in, and cranked it out, and was able to do a pretty good job of it as a result of technology coming in. So some of us watched that evolution and liked it and welcomed it, and it's great. But the other thing that happened was the culture of reporting changed. pretty drastically. And David Simon, who was in the next room, said this best. He wrote it in an essay in Esquire. And he was a former reporter, right? And he describes that day when it became clear to him he was no longer welcome in the newsroom. And he was the stereotypical, irascible, curmudgeonly reporter that would say anything to anybody in the newsroom at any time. And that rang so true with me because I remember the day clearly when it became clear to me I was no longer welcome in the newsroom because I was that kind of a guy. I was something of a jerk, to tell you the truth. But that's what you were paid to be at the time. And you challenged your own editors the same way you challenged people on the outside. And the corporate culture imposed that change on reporters, and I do believe that there has been a screening process ever since that has screened out guys like me. That may make a more pleasant place to work, but I think it's less effective. And I think that the reporters who survive that system are people who are willing to put up with the corporate culture.
I'm going to let you answer that.
Answer what?
I'm going to let you answer, Stan, because I find this interesting to me. I have not been a newspaper reporter for 3.5 years. I am absolutely not able to be objective about it and give an objective answer to a question like that. I am just about unable to find fault with reporters because I love them so much. And I'm like Dick and like so many colleagues of mine who have left newsrooms who say, I miss a newsroom every day. And what you end up telling yourself is you miss a mythical newsroom that is not there anymore, is just simply not there. But I find still that even 3.5 years away from being a newspaper reporter, I see reporters as not having much power over their own situation, whether it's reporting methods or money that they spend to report. And I was in that same newsroom that Dick was, and I think that was sort of the tail end of reporters really being able to throw their weight around with their editors. And so I don't blame them. Corporate ownership of the media, that's a whole different thing, and that's probably where the fault lies. What's your feeling about it?
I got to interrupt just slightly here, the flow. Full disclosure, Ginny and I are close friends and have been, for 25 years now. And the tenor of our conversation about this issue, and we talk about this all the time, this is not a new conversation. The tenor of our conversation changed drastically when Ginny left the newsroom. And it's not that, it is she changed her mind about some things, but it's not so much that as she had a new perspective and suddenly what I'd been saying for 20 years looked different. You agree?
Yeah. I do.
What about some of the non-profits like Mother Jones or High Country News or Orion? It seems like the reader really has to go out and find these sources of independent journalism. Is there any hope that mainstream can sort of get back on track doing some of that stuff?
Yeah, I think that's rat chow, pushing the bar for rat chow in a lot of ways. And the nonprofit model is just a lot of people who mean well and struggling to make something work that's broken. And you can make it work for a while. In fact, there's some promising things going on. There's one in, I think, Chicago that's just signed an agreement to sell content to the New York Times. And what do I think of that? Times lays off 100 people, signs on with a nonprofit. Sounds like union busting to me, but if you think about, one of the success stories in journalism right now is NPR. It's increasing its audience. NPR agreed a couple months ago now to not use the word torture when referring to the administration. There was a company-wide, organizational-wide memo went out that we won't call this torture. We'll call this enhanced interrogation techniques, as the Bush administration suggested to us. And in fact, there was a great deal of uproar about that and blogs and things like that. And For my money, journalism is calling things by their name. That's your first job as a journalist. And when you agree to euphemism, then something's gone very awry in your system. And I remember hearing the very next morning a report on NPR that the raspberry jam at this fair was yummy. And now we have hard-hitting investigative journalism, but we won't talk about torture. My point is that the nonprofit model is as vulnerable and is as susceptible to manipulation as was the for-profit model. And I've watched not just in journalism, but a lot of nonprofits work, and rich people demand that the mission match their ideas, even if their ideas are this wide. And the nonprofit model scares me every bit as much. And I'm much more comfortable with market solutions as a result of that, because you can maintain some independence from the money. When somebody writes you one very big, large check to your organization, that person owns your organization. Yes?
Could you speak to the role of documentary film in the fact that, I guess one of the things that I've wondered about is, since we're losing investigative journalism in real time, where will we find the people to really compare events over time so that we can get accurate information about things as they unfold? You know, there's so much information out there now. It's hard for the average consumer to keep track of an issue, you know, even at the, you know, federal level over time. And, you know, I'm wondering about the role of documentary film in creating a new media for the kind of information that all of us are hungry for, which is really facts about what has transpired. And do you see any ability for that to bridge the gap here for the American public?
There's a spotty ability. Sometimes some great work's been done, but there's nothing new about it. Documentary's been with us for a very long time. Let me answer with kind of following the career of a friend of mine, a woman named Susan Austin, who was a night fellow with me. I mentioned at Stanford. She introduced herself the first day to the 12 journalists as, "I'm the shallow one, I'm from TV," right? But she had that kind of sense of humor. Susan made her name by doing a documentary on female genital mutilation in Africa, and was able to get that on ABC in long form only by calling Ted Kennedy to intervene, and literally call, I think it was Roone Arledge at the time, on the golf course to get him to put the film on, but got it on. That's the kind of fighter she was and is. She left the fellowship and took a job. She left ABC and went to work for Oprah as a producer. Lasted about a year and a half, supposedly to do long form documentaries for Oprah. Lasted about a year and a half, left in all sorts of acrimony with attorneys and non-disclosure agreements and all that fun stuff. Went back to work for ABC, producing for, God, the guy who just left. I don't watch TV, so. At any rate, she was producing ABC News. So I called her when I was doing this story on child abuse, and I said, "Hey, we need to do," she said, "Forget it, long form's dead. We can't, you know, it's just not going to work, not at network." Now, it's worked outside of network, and there's some pretty good independent markets, so people have been able to put together the money to do long form stuff. It's not going to be dependable on day-to-day stuff. Its success is sporadic. You're not going to get your daily feed out of it, but when it's done right, it's a wonderful form. And like everything else, you got to find the money for it to make it work. This is expensive, and that's the one thing that people don't want to quite understand. They think that you can be a blogger in your pajamas in your bedroom and do a great job of journalism. You know, when I go to work, I fly on airplanes and stay in hotels, and I buy information whenever I can get it, and I try to make as much money as I possibly can. And that's expensive to do good stuff.
So you talk about the corporate culture suppressing guys like you. Why would the antecedent of that, which was probably a wealthy individual that owned the paper and very opinionated, why would that create a better newsroom culture? It seems like that's just a top-down authoritarian model with somebody that's very opinionated. And why would it be more likely that an irascible reporter would be more
Yeah. My first job was at a family-owned newspaper in Michigan, my hometown. It's paper 13,000 circulation, which is minuscule. The owner was a guy named Phil Richards. His family had owned the paper for generations. He was eccentric as all get out. He was as timid on some issues as most, but he had a sign on his wall that said, "The duty of a newspaper is to print the news and raise hell." And he meant it, because I tested it several times. And it was because of his engagement with the community that he understood the importance of the issues. Contrast that to a corporation that's trying to manage a whole series of newspapers. You don't do that seat of the pants. You don't do that by engaging the community. You do that by putting together a memo that outlines what you will and will not do at that newspaper, and then you do that by bringing in your publisher once a year and say, where's your 7% growth for the last year? You didn't grow 7%? You're fired. We've got a new guy coming in. That's the difference in a nutshell that we watched happen over those years of family-owned versus. There are all sorts of problems with family-owned newspapers. There are a lot of horrible ones out there, but they tended to be isolated. When you get a horrible corporation owning newspapers, you're not isolated anymore. You got a bunch of horrible newspapers. So I think that was in some ways the difference. Yeah, we had problems back then, but they were squared when corporations took over. You want a piece of that?
No. That was good.
I guess I wonder why everyone's so pessimistic about blogs. Because things like Talking Points Memo have, led the national conversation about a lot of things.
Who's going to pay them?
What's that?
Who's going to pay them?
Talking Points Memo makes money. It's made millions of dollars.
Yeah, but
they just got, a lot of funding. And then, a lot of bloggers make money right now. They just don't have an entire newspaper behind them, and so they just don't need as much to survive on. And then there are lots of different blogs that are starting out in mid-sized cities like Seattle or Minneapolis. And so I just don't understand the pessimism about it.
yeah, there's some cheap shots, low-hanging fruit that could happen for a blogger, but by and large, investigative journalism is expensive. You don't do it at blog level. You do it with a whole organization behind you, a big organization that's able to pull these things off. And yeah, their costs are lower, and there are some savings to be had, and I talked about that within the price of newsprint and so forth. I would love to see all journalism electronic. Yeah, I get my newsprint, my daily news source comes on the internet. That's where I get it. I tend not to read blogs because I don't think they are that successful in gathering the kind of news that, so.
Like the Attorney General scandal.
Pardon me?
The Attorney General scandal that the Talking Points Memo broke, that was, just easy investigation.
Yeah.
That was low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. That's the kind of, no.
They took down the Attorney General.
There's some great stories that come across in one memo,
They want to poke a
or one tip, or one source that can get you something.
That was like 20 sources across multiple states.
But that is not the rule of the blogosphere. That's the exception. Fine, have at them. Good luck. I hope you're right.
I don't understand.
I hope you're right.
You say, neither of you are journalists anymore. That just seems really sad. You've given up on journalism. You say you're doing all these other great things.
I'm on assignment right now.
All right. You said that you just got turned down on both of the things you did.
No, and then I said I got the assignment with Oprah.
Okay.
Oprah Magazine. I'm on assignment right now. Yeah, exactly.
Take a couple more questions and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Okay.
So I like reporting and I love reading good reporting, but I see journalism as a means to an end, which is the civic discussion, maybe a shared set of facts that allows that to happen. What is a different means to that end, and what role are journalists or people who are trained as journalists or people who have the same skills as journalists gonna play in getting us to a civic discussion with a shared set of facts that makes democracy work?
Yeah, and that's the very discussion we wanted to have, and we started out talking about, and I think we got directed away from it to a degree. But when Ginny and I were thinking about this, I was thinking about, why did we go into this in the first place? Why did we decide we want to be journalists? Because we like to write? Yeah, that's true. That's part of it. But we want to also influence public policy, that we think we have a role in democracy. Can we play that role without journalism? And so that's what we've started talking in terms of our ability to network people and make information move within organizations and to reach audiences. And all that's very powerful stuff. And I think that is the answer. I think that we move away and say, okay, journalism and blogosphere and all that stuff, do what it's going to do. But for some of us, it can be effective if we go in organizations and trade in information as we always have. And make information work and write compelling cases as we always have. And try to use those skills we developed, which turn out to, I think, be far more powerful than the printed word in some ways, of just getting, something across the table at breakfast.
So we have a bridge from the past to the future in terms of people who have been inculcated with this culture of reporting and investigating, and they understand that reporting is something different than repeating, and it's something different than opining. But are journalism schools doing something to create in journalists that are coming up now the skills that they're going to need in order to be the means to this end, which is democratic society?
Jen, you have?
Can we club them about the head and make them do so?
Well, I think they are. I am not, of course, in the journalism school every day. I have a former colleague who is, and who says it is incredible how journalism students today still think about the same values and want the same things, and are as excited about it as we were, but they're looking at different methods of delivery for their reporting and what they do. And I think that they're all being trained to use every possible medium. And that right there is just so different from what we had, and I think that that's going to be really helpful.
I think it was Arizona State that had set the mission for its journalism school, just rededicated the journalism school. We're not going to teach journalism. Our mission is to rethink this and come up with new ways to do it. And that project's quite young, and so 6 months, a year ago that I read about it. So there's some conscious effort at some J schools to do that and think of it, but nobody's cracked the case on the business model yet. That's not been done.
I was just curious, I heard there was a professor from the University of Illinois Journalism School who is advocating for subsidized journalism, and I was just wondering what you guys' opinion on something like that.
Subsidized by the public?
By the public.
Which is sort of the same as the nonprofit model that we were talking about, or for instance, are you referring to the notion of maybe having it taxed, paid for with tax money?
Yeah, BBC and
that
NPR.
kind of thing, like
Where
BBC and
they
NPR.
had a lot of their expenses waived, such as postage or something like that, where it wasn't directly influencing their reporting, but it was influencing their budget.
It's certainly something to entertain. I think it probably has the same pitfalls that we've been talking about that are present in journalism that's paid for by advertisers or journalism that's paid for by donors. Same kind of thing, but could also work.
Yeah, I have the same problems I do with,
But has the same problems.
yeah, the same set of problems. And part of it's cultural, I think. And it's that, as Jenny said earlier, that we're longing for newsrooms that don't exist anymore. And to a certain extent, our culture's been sanitized across the board.
But I think we're longing for an audience that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah,
Before Katrina happened,
correct.
there had been a dozen of stories written about how fucked up the dikes were, and they were not going to last. Before 9/11 happened, there had been a series of stories for 25 years about modernizing the cockpits in our fucking airplanes. And so the problem is that I don't think journalists actually have failed. I don't think the business model itself is unsustainable on all of its front, including the blogs, which occasionally do get lucky. And I think it is one. But the audience, we're here interested, but we reported stuff in the PI. My lab, for 10 years there, occasionally David McCumber reported his thing on Libby. And those were meaningful stories. And that actually ended up in the court. And that's really where justice in America seems to happen anymore. Instead of public opinion chasing people down with their votes, public opinion dies, fizzles, becomes lame, and we end up in court, and that's where only things happen anymore. I feel like I pine for the newsroom I used to have. It's a hell of a lot of fun. But what I really pine for is an activist community around that newspaper willing to act on information. And that's not happening.
Yeah, we came off of 8 years of a Stonewall culture. And that is rippled through. And it's not just journalism, it's that people got scared after 9/11, that we became a nation of paranoid people. And we trusted authority, and we saw that reflected in journalism, for instance, what Judith Miller did in the New York Times. The ability to suck up or to buy lies from an administration.
Because they were first.
Yeah, and it doesn't. And the culture accepted that. We were all in that. You're exactly right. The audience was in on that too. And so at the same time we're working against these business issues, we're working against that mindset that got us in such a jam.
I've been having a heated conversation on my Facebook page for the last 2 days. I posted a link to a Boston Globe story about how, about a congressional report that was leaked saying that Obama has had 400% more threats than Bush, and the Secret Service, because of the declining budget and the increase, is struggling to protect him. And about 3 of my friends have said that that story was dangerous, shouldn't have been published, put the president at risk, and incited controversy and divisiveness. And then about three of us have been arguing that information is crucial to democracy and that, that it's a valuable dialogue. But it frightens me because studies show that the majority of Americans, or a majority of Americans, support controls on freedom of information, freedom of the press. Yeah. And it's frightening. It's
horribly frightening.
The audience is becoming dumber and dumber and more paranoid. So how do we fight against that, when...
How do they feel about the control of television?
Well, that's another thing, is that newspapers and, serious media gets lumped in with cable news and, Fox and entertainment shows.
So I think we need to wrap it up. It's a very interesting discussion, and I want to talk to you because, but I won't right now. So thank you so much, and Richard, you'll be out signing your
Sure.
work. And,
ready for the throngs.